Welcome everyone. In today's lecture I'm going to be covering deterrence theory and rational choice theory, two of the more important perspectives in criminology theory. These theories are foundational because they ask one of the oldest and most policy-relevant questions in criminology. Why do people refrain from crime? Rather than beginning with pathology, poverty, social disorganization, peer influence, or strain, deterrence theory begins with a relatively simple idea. People can be discouraged from crime if the expected costs of offending outweigh the expected benefits. That basic idea has shaped centuries of criminal law and criminal justice policy. It influences how we think about policing, sentencing, incarceration, probation, parole, and the death penalty, drug enforcement, terrorism, corporate crime, and even everyday rule compliance. But as we will see throughout this lecture, deterrence theory is both powerful and limited. It is powerful because it gives us a clear theory of crime prevention. It tells us that punishment can shape behavior if it is certain, severe, and swift. But it is limited because human beings are not always perfectly rational calculators. People act under stress, emotion, misinformation, peer influence, poverty, addiction, anger, and limited self-control. A lot of variables to assess there. So the central question for today is not simply, does punishment deter crime? The better question is, under what conditions does punishment deter crime? For whom? For what types of crime? And through what mechanisms? That is the level of thinking needed for a comprehensive exam answer. A strong answer should not simply say that deterrence theory argues punishment prevents crime. That's far too basic. A stronger answer would explain the assumptions, mechanisms, empirical evidence, criticisms, and policy implications of the theory. And this is what I'm going to try to explain in this lecture. I built this lecture around the core readings from deterrence and rational choice portion of the theory reading list, including Beccaria, Bentham, Gibbs, Pasternaster, Nagin, Cornish, and Clark, Pagarsey, Pickett, Chalfin, and Macari, and many others. So as I move through this lecture, pay attention to four things: the core concepts, the causal mechanism, the empirical support, and the major critiques. So here's the roadmap for today's lecture. First, we're going to begin with why deterrence theory matters. I think this is important because deterrence is not just an academic theory, it's one of the main assumptions behind modern criminal justice policy. Second, we'll be covering the classic criminological foundations of deterrence, especially the work of Jeremy Bentham. Third, we'll be distinguishing between general deterrence and specific deterrence. Fourth, we'll be discussing the three major elements of deterrence, that being certainty, severity, and celerity. Fifth, we will examine the difference between objective deterrence and perceptual deterrence. This distinction is crucial because people don't always respond directly to the actual probability of punishment. They respond to what they think the probability of punishment is. People don't always know the laws. Sixth, we'll be moving into rational choice theory. Rational choice theory is related to deterrence theory, but it's not exactly the same thing. Deterrence focuses heavily on punishment, and rational choice theory focuses more broadly on decision-making, opportunity, effort, reward, and risk. Seventh, we will be discussing bounded rationality, which is the idea that offenders make decisions, but they do not make perfectly informed or perfectly logical decisions. Eighth, we'll be discussing emotional deterrence, including shame, guilt, fear, embarrassment, and social costs. Ninth, we'll be evaluating empirical evidence. What does research actually show? Does certainty matter? Does severity matter? Does imprisonment reduce crime? Does punishment sometimes increase offending? 10th, we'll be examining major critiques of deterrence theory, including causal order problems, endogeneity, measurement problems, inequality, and the limits of rationality. 11th, I'll be moving more into policy implications. And finally, I'll be ending with the theory integration. So how does deterrence and rational choice connect to strain theory, social learning theory, control theory, life course theory, just more modern criminological thinking? I think the structure is going to help me out with my comprehensive exam, and a good exam answer definitely needs to do more than just defining the theory. So I'm really going to be trying to explain the theory here, evaluate it, compare it to other different theories, and then discuss its implications. Deterrence theory matters for several reasons. First, this is one of the oldest criminological theories. Its roots go back to classic criminology in the 18th century, especially the Enlightenment. This makes it very different from later positivist theories that focus on biological, psychological, or even social causes of crime. Second, deterrence theory remains one of the most influential perspectives in criminal justice policy. Even when policymakers don't explicitly use the phrase deterrence theory, they often rely on deterrence assumptions. For example, when legislators support harsher prison sentences, they're usually assuming that harsher punishment will discourage crime. When police departments increase patrols in high-crime areas, they're often assuming that visible enforcement will increase perceived certainty of punishment. When governments use mandatory minimum sentences, like three-strikes laws, sex offender registries, DUI checkpoints, drug enforcement, or the death penalty, they're often relying on some version of deterrence logic. Now, Now, the core assumption of deterrence theory is straightforward. People respond to incentives. If crime becomes more costly, then people should be less likely to commit crime. If the probability of getting caught increases, people should think twice. If punishment is severe enough, people should be afraid to offend. If punishment comes quickly after the offense, people should connect the punishment to the behavior and avoid doing it again. So that's the basic logic. But this immediately raises a more complicated question. Do people actually think this way before committing a crime? For some offenses, the answer may be yes. A corporate executive deciding whether or not to commit fraud may think about the legal risks, financial gain, and regulatory oversight, or reputational damage. A person deciding whether to speed on a highway might think about the likelihood of police presence. A college student deciding whether to use a fake ID might consider whether the bar checks IDs carefully. But for other offenses, deterrence may be much weaker. A person acting in anger, intoxication, desperation, or under peer pressure may not carefully weigh the costs and benefits of their actions. So this is a clear flaw with deterrence theory. A person involved in a violent altercation might not stop to calculate the expected punishment. A person with low self-control may heavily discount future consequences. So deterrence theory here matters because it's giving us a clear policy-relevant model of crime prevention, but it's also raising major questions about rationality, perceptions, emotions, and context. So this is why deterrence theory remains important for comprehensive exams. It's not enough to say that just punishment deters crime. The stronger answer is deterrence theory argues that punishment can deter crime when individuals perceive punishment as sufficiently certain, severe, and swift. But empirical research suggests that certainty tends to matter more than severity. And the theory faces important limitations related to rationality, perception, emotion, inequality, and causal order. To understand deterrence theory, we have to begin with Enlightenment. Before classical criminology, punishment was often arbitrary, brutal, and inconsistent. Criminal justice systems in Europe were shaped by monarchy, religious authority, public spectacle, and extreme punishment. Torture, public executions, mutilation, and harsh corporal punishments were very commonplace. Punishment was not always proportional to the offense. Laws weren't always clear, and judges often had enormous amounts of discretion. So if you have two people who say committed similar acts, they might receive very different punishments depending on their status, or the judge, or even political context, or just the mood of the authorities during that day. But classic criminology emerged as a critique of this system. Classical theorists argued that law should be rational, predictable, proportional, and secular. Rather than explaining crime as a product of evil spirits, sins, demonic possession, or inherent wickedness, classical thinkers viewed crime as behavior committed by rational human beings. This was a major shift. Classical school assumed that people have free will, people make choices, and they pursue pleasure and avoid pain. Therefore, the law can influence behavior by arranging consequences in such a way that crime becomes unattractive. And this is where deterrence theory begins. So, the goal of punishment from this view is not revenge, it's not cruelty, it's not even moral condemnation. The goal is simply prevention. Punishment is justified only to the extent that it prevents greater harm. This is a major Enlightenment principle, and the law should not punish excessively. It should only punish as much as necessary to prevent future crime. And this is why Beccaria is so important. Beccaria's work on crime and punishments, published in 1764, argued against torture, arbitrary punishment, and excessive severity. He believed that punishment should be public, prompt, necessary, proportionate, and established by the law. The major point is that punishment should be rationalized. So classical criminology is both a theory of crime and a theory of justice. It says that crime occurs because people make choices, but it also says that the state must constrain its own punishment. Punishment should be lawful, predictable, proportionate, and designed to prevent future crime. That is the classical foundation. Okay, now we're getting into Cesare Beccaria, who is one of the most important classical theorists for deterrence theory. Beccaria's central argument is that punishment should be designed to prevent crime, not simply to inflict suffering. He believed that humans are rational actors who weigh pleasure and pain. If punishment is certain, proportional, and swift, then people will be discouraged from committing crime. One of Beccaria's more famous ideas is that the certainty of punishment is more important than severity. This is absolutely central. Beccaria argued that harsh punishment is not necessarily effective. In fact, excessively severe punishment can be counterproductive. If punishments are too harsh, they may lose legitimacy. They may encourage brutality. They may make people view the state as unjust. They may also lead decision makers to avoid enforcement because the punishment feels disproportionate. For example, if a minor theft carried the death penalty, juries might refuse to convict. Witnesses might hesitate to cooperate, the judge might avoid imposing a harsh punishment, so increasing the severity can actually reduce certainty. And this insight remains incredibly important in modern deterrence research. Many contemporary scholars, including Nagin and Pasternasser, emphasize that certainty tends to have much stronger deterrent effects than severity. This is one of the more consistent findings in deterrence research. Beccaria also argued for proportionality. Punishment should fit the crime. If all crimes are punished equally harsh, then there's no incentive to commit lesser crime than a greater crime. Imagine if robbery and murder received the same level of punishment. A robber might have the incentive to kill the witness because the punishment would not increase. Beccaria understood that proportional punishment can shape behavior by preserving gradations of seriousness. Beccaria also opposed torture. He argued that torture was irrational because it did not reliably reveal truth. A guilty person with physical strength might withstand torture, while an innocent person might simply confess to end the pain. So in Beccaria's eyes, torture was both cruel and ineffective. Beccaria also opposed the death penalty in most circumstances. His argument was not simply sentimental, it was more theoretical. He believed that the death penalty was not necessary for deterrence and that lifelong deprivation of liberty could be more effective and more consistent with rational punishment. The broader lesson from Beccaria is that punishment should be certain, proportionate, swift, and restrained. This is why Beccaria is so important for deterrence theory. He gives us a foundation for thinking about punishment as a rational tool of prevention. So to close off this section, Beccaria's classical theory rests on the assumption that individuals possess free will and respond to incentives. Punishment deters crime not because it's maximally harsh, but because it's predictable, proportionate, and certain. Thus, Beccaria's contribution is both criminological and legal. He provides a theory of offending and a theory of limited rational punishment. So now we're looking at Jeremy Bentham and hedonic calculus. So Bentham further developed the rational choice foundation of classic criminology. Bentham is associated with utilitarianism, especially the idea that human beings seek pleasure and avoid pain. In simple terms, people act in ways they believe will maximize happiness or utility. And this is where we get the idea of hedonistic or hedonic calculus. The hedonic calculus suggests that people consider the potential pleasures and pains associated with an action. So applying this to crime, the logic here is that an individual may commit crime when the expected pleasure or benefit of offending exceeds the expected pain or the cost of punishment. So if the perceived reward is high and the perceived risk is low, and the perceived punishment is not severe or immediate, crime becomes more likely. And this gives us a simple model. Expected utility of crime equals expected benefits minus expected costs. The benefits might include things like money, status, revenge, excitement, peer approval, emotional release, or some other gain. And the costs might include arrest, conviction, imprisonment, shame, guilt, injury, retaliation, loss of employment, or damage to relationships. Now, Bentham's framework matters because it gives deterrence theory its decision-making logic. Crime is not random, crime is not simply evil, crime is not only pathology, crime is behavior that can be influenced by incentives. But we still need to be careful here because Bentham's model can sound overly rational if we take it too literally. Most offenders are probably not sitting down with a calculator before committing crime. I think it's fair to say that most offenders are not formally estimating expected utility with their crimes. They're not assigning a numerical value to punishment. Instead, the more defensible version of this theory is that people are responsive to perceived costs and benefits, even if their calculations are informal, incomplete, emotional, or even biased. And this is where the modern rational choice theory modifies classical criminology. Modern rational choice theorists, especially Cornish and Clark, don't necessarily assume perfect rationality. They emphasize bounded rationality. Offenders make decisions, but those decisions are constrained by limited information, immediate situations, emotions, habits, and opportunities. Classical theory begins with rationality and utility maximization. Modern deterrence and rational choice theory retain the idea that offenders respond to incentives, but they soften the assumption of perfect rational calculation. And this matters because one of the more important critiques of deterrence theory is that it assumes too much rationality. And we can't ignore this critique. Classical deterrence theory begins with rationality, but modern versions increasingly recognize bounded rationality, perceptual risk, cognitive bias, and emotional decision-making. So there are some core assumptions of classical criminology. First, classical criminology assumes free will. This means individuals are viewed as capable of making choices. They're not simply determined by biology, psychology, social structure, or environment. Of course, later criminological theories will challenge this assumption, but as far as classical theory is concerned, free will is essential. Second, classical criminology assumes rationality. People are thought to respond to incentives. They seek rewards and avoid costs. They may choose crime where they believe crime will produce more benefit than harm. Third, classical criminology assumes that punishment can prevent crime. Punishment works by increasing the expected cost of offending. If punishment is likely enough, serious enough, and quick enough, then crime should become less attractive. Fourth, punishment should be proportionate. Punishment should not be more severe than necessary. It should correspond to the seriousness of the offense. This is crucial for both morality and practicality. Fifth, the law should be predictable. If people are going to be deterred in a meaningful way, then they should know what the law is and what the consequences of breaking the law are. So, for instance, arbitrary punishment shouldn't effectively deter people. So, for instance, arbitrary punishment can't effectively deter people if they can't adjust their behavior to unpredictable rules. Sixth, The punishment should be certain, swift, and severe. These become three classical elements of deterrence: certainty, severity, and celerity. Certainty refers to the likelihood of punishment. Severity refers to the harshness of punishment. Celerity refers to the swiftness with the punishment that follows the offense. In theory, all three of these matter, but empirically, they don't really all matter equally. The strongest and most consistent evidence seems to support certainty. People are more likely to be deterred when they believe they are likely to be caught. Severity, by contrast, has weaker and more inconsistent evidence. Celerity is theoretically important, but empirically difficult to study. This is why the phase certainty over severity is so important. A punishment system that is extremely harsh but rarely enforced may have little deterrent effect. A punishment system that is moderate but predictable may be more effective. For example, if we have two cities, in City A, the punishment for drunk driving is extremely harsh, but police rarely stop drivers and enforcement is inconsistent. In City B, the punishment is moderate, but DUI enforcement is visible, predictable, and widely known. Deterrence theory would predict that City B may produce stronger deterrence because the certainty of punishment is much higher. So this example here is capturing the heart of modern deterrence research. So to close out this first section, I want to end by saying that deterrence theory begins with classical criminology. Beccaria and Bentham argued that people are rational actors who respond to pleasure and pain. Punishment can prevent crime when it's certain, proportionate, swift, and predictable. But modern criminology complicates this foundation by showing that perceptions, emotions, bounded rationality, social context, and empirical measurement problems all shape whether deterrence works in practice. And this gives us the foundation we need to now move into more specific elements of deterrence: general deterrence, specific deterrence, certainty, severity, and celerity. So now that we've covered all of the classic foundations of deterrence theory, we can move into one of the most important distinctions within deterrence research: the difference between general deterrence and specific deterrence. This distinction is fundamental and extremely important for comprehensive exams because students often collapse these two concepts together. They are related, but they operate through different mechanisms and involve different units of analysis. So let's begin with general deterrence. General deterrence refers to the idea that punishment discourages crime among the broader public. The key mechanism is observation and perception. Individuals observe punishment happening to others, or they become aware of an enforcement practice, and then they decide not to offend because of the fear of experiencing similar punishment themselves. So, in other words, the punishment of one individual sends a message to many others. So, an example for you here would be when a police department conducts highly visible DUI checkpoints, the goal is not only to arrest impaired drivers at that specific location, the broader goal is to increase the public's perception that drunk driving is risky. Ideally, people hear about the enforcement, they see the police presence, or observe others being arrested, and then they decide not to drive under the influence in the future. So this would be general deterrence at work. Similarly, publicized white-collar prosecutions are often intended to deter others in similar positions. If a corporate executive sees another executive prosecuted for fraud, the assumption is that the observer may reconsider engaging in similar misconduct. Specific deterrence, by contrast, refers to the idea that punishment discourages future offending by a person who is actually punished. The mechanism here is the direct experience rather than observation. An individual experiences arrest, incarceration, say probation, fines, embarrassment, or some other sanction, and then they decide not to reoffend because of that punishment. Whether the punishment was unpleasant or costly to them, either way, they are deciding to not reoffend because of the punishment they experienced firsthand. So, for example, suppose we have an individual who's arrested for shoplifting and experiences jail time, financial penalties, and public embarrassment. So, specific deterrence theory predicts that this individual may avoid future offending because they now understand the personal costs associated with crime. So, the clear distinction here is general deterrence works through public awareness and perceived risk, and specific deterrence works through direct punishment experience. Now, this distinction raises an important empirical question. Does punishment actually reduce future offending among punished individuals? Interestingly, the answer is more complicated than classical theory originally assumed. Research on specific deterrence often produces mixed findings. In some cases, punishment may reduce offending, but in other cases, punishment may actually increase future crime. Now, why is this? Because punishment can also generate criminogenic effects. For example, incarceration may weaken employment opportunities, damage family relationships, increase stigma, expose offenders to criminal peers, or strengthen criminal identity, and these effects may increase recidivism rather than reducing it. This is why modern deterrence research became increasingly nuanced. A simple deterrence argument says that punishment reduces crime. A more advanced deterrence argument would say that punishment may deter under some conditions, but may also increase offending under bother others. This is especially important for comprehensive exams because examiners are looking at theoretical sophistication awareness for complexity. So for example, if incarceration reduces crime because offenders are physically unable to commit offenses while being imprisoned, this would be incapacitation, not deterrence. If incarceration reduces crime because offenders develop new skills or values, that would be rehabilitation. If incarceration reduces crime because people fear punishment, that is deterrence. And if incarceration increases crime because prison socializes offenders into criminal lifestyles, then punishment may actually undermine deterrence. The distinction becomes especially important later when we discuss imprisonment and offending research. Now we move into what is arguably the single most important concept in deterrence research: certainty of punishment. Certainty refers to the perceived likelihood that offending will result in punishment. This is not necessarily the actual probability of punishment. What matters most is often the offender's perception of risk. And this distinction becomes extremely important later when we discuss perceptual deterrence theory. But for now, the key idea here is very simple. The more likely that an individual believes they're going to be caught or punished, the less likely they are to offend. So among the three classic deterrence dimensions, being certainty, severity, and celerity, certainty consistently receives the strongest empirical support. This is one of the most important takeaways from modern deterrence research. Nagin's review of deterrence literature strongly emphasizes that certainty appears to matter more than severity. Similarly, Chalfin and Macari's review of criminal deterrence research concludes that increasing the probability of apprehension generally produces stronger deterrent effects than increasing sentence length. So why would certainty matter more? Well, that's because individuals tend to respond more strongly to immediate and concrete risks than distant or abstract punishments. Let's imagine we have two different scenarios here. Let's say we have two scenarios. In the first scenario, the punishment for armed robbery is increased dramatically from 10 years to 25 years. But offenders believe that the likelihood of being caught remains low. In the second scenario, the punishment stays the same, but police presence increases significantly and offenders believe arrest is highly likely. Deterrence theory predicts that the second scenario may produce greater deterrence because certainty directly affects the perceived risk, and this has a major policy implication. Politicians often focus heavily on increasing punishment severity because harsher punishment appears to be more politically strong. But deterrence research repeatedly suggests that increasing certainty might be more effective than increasing the severity of the crime. Politicians often focus heavily on increasing punishment severity because harsher punishment appears to be politically strong. But deterrence research has shown us that increasing the certainty of a crime may be more effective than increasing the actual severity. And this is why visible policing strategies are often rooted in deterrence assumptions. Hotspot policings, directed patrols, focused deterrence programs, DUI checkpoints, all of these are attempting to increase the perceived certainty of punishment. The logic is not necessarily to arrest everyone. The logic is to create the perception that offending is risky. So there are some important caveats we have to remember here. Certainty effects depend heavily on visibility and perception. If offenders fail to notice enforcement, or if they believe they can avoid detection despite increased policing, then the deterrent effect might weaken. Furthermore, certainty effects may vary by offense type. Certainty may matter strongly for calculated offenses such as tax fraud, insider trading, or planned theft, but certainty of punishment may matter less for impulsive violence, emotionally driven assaults, or offenses committed under intoxication. This again points us toward the important principle in criminology that theories have scope conditions. Deterrence theory is generally strongest when offenders are perceiving enforcement clearly, decision-making involves some level of calculation, and punishment risks are cognitively available before the offense occurs. So now we move into severity of punishment. Severity refers to the harshness or intensity of the punishment. Examples include things like longer prison sentences, mandatory minimums, 3-strike laws, life imprisonment, solitary confinement, or things like capital punishment. Classical deterrence theory predicts that harsher punishments should discourage crime because they increase the cost side of the cost-benefit equation. However, empirical research on severity is much weaker and far less consistent than research on certainty. This is one of the most important findings in deterrence literature. Increasing punishment severity often produces only modest deterrent effects, inconsistent effects, or no measurable effects at all. Why is this? Well, there are several reasons. First, offenders might not know the exact severity of the punishment. Many offenders cannot accurately distinguish between a 10-year sentence and a 20-year sentence before offending. If people don't know the punishment structure, increasing severity may not meaningfully affect decision-making. Second, many offenders discount future consequence. This is especially true amongst impulsive individuals, adolescents, or individuals with low self-control. A person focused heavily on the immediate rewards might not care much about whether punishment occurs 5 years or 15 years later. Third, certainty and severity interact. A very severe punishment may have very little deterrent value if the probability of getting caught is perceived as extremely low. Again, this reflects Beccaria's insight that certainty might matter more than severity. Now, this has enormous implications for criminal justice policy. Most of American criminal justice policy has emphasized punitive severity, mandatory minimums, truth in sentencing laws, sentencing enhancements, habitual offender statutes, and mass incarceration. Yet deterrence research often suggests diminishing returns from increasing severity alone, which creates a tension between the political rhetoric espoused and empirical evidence that we've observed. Politically, harsher punishment often appears to be attractive because it signals toughness on crime. Empirically, however, increasing sentence length may not substantially reduce offending. This does not mean that severity never matters. In fact, for some offenses and offenders, severity may influence decision-making. But overall, the evidence for severity is generally weaker than for certainty. The deterrence literature generally finds stronger support for certainty than severity, which suggests that increasing the likelihood of punishment tends to produce greater deterrent effects than increasing sentence harshness. Now we move on to celerity of punishment. The third classical deterrence dimension is celerity, or otherwise known as swiftness. Celerity refers to how quickly a punishment follows the offender's actions. Classical theory predicts that punishment should have stronger deterrent effects when it occurs immediately or soon after the offense. The logic is psychological. When punishment follows behavior quickly, individuals more easily connect the punishment to the act. Delayed punishment weakens that association. The idea overlaps somewhat with behavioral psychology and reinforcement theory. Now, theoretically, celerity makes sense, but empirically, celerity has been far more difficult to study. And this is because the criminal justice system is very slow. Arrest, prosecution, plea bargaining, sentencing, and incarceration may occur over many different months or years after the original offense takes place. So with this said, this delay weakens the visibility and the immediacy of the punishment. Additionally, measuring swiftness precisely can be difficult. Researchers may struggle to determine when offenders became aware of the punishment, how quickly punishment must occur to matter, and whether delays affect perception consistently across offense types. Despite these challenges, some modern policies have attempted to emphasize celerity. One example is swift and certain sanctioning models. Programs such as Hawaii's HOPE probation model attempted to create rapid, predictable responses to probation violations. The idea here was straightforward, that minor violations would produce immediate sanctions rather than delayed or inconsistent punishments. The theoretical assumption was that certainty and swiftness together may be far more effective than extremely severe punishments delivered inconsistently. This reflects a broader shift in modern deterrence thinking. Predictability may matter more than harshness, and again, this traces directly back to Beccaria. Now we arrive at one of the more important conceptual shifts in modern deterrence research, the distinction between objective deterrence and perceptual deterrence. Objective deterrence refers to actual punishment levels and actual enforcement patterns. For example, things like arrest rates, actual sentence lengths, actual police response, or the conviction probabilities, while perceptual deterrence focuses on subjective perceptions of punishment risk. So this distinction is absolutely crucial here. People don't respond directly to objective statistics, they respond to what they believe the risks are. An offender may dramatically overestimate punishment risk or dramatically underestimate it. For example, you can have two different people living in the same city who may perceive policing completely differently. One individual may perceive police presence as extremely high and therefore avoid offending, and the other individual may believe that they can easily avoid detection and therefore perceive little risk. Objectively, they have the same legal environment. Subjectively, they don't. And this insight transformed deterrence research. Scholars such as Erickson, Gibbs, and Jensen examined how perceived certainty influences offending behavior. Perceptual deterrence research increasingly focused on subjective beliefs rather than formal punishment structures alone. This shift matters because actual punishment levels alone may not explain crime patterns very well. What matters is whether offenders notice enforcement, believe punishment is likely, and internalize those perceptions into decision-making. This also helps explain why highly publicized enforcement campaigns can matter even if actual arrest rates remain relatively stable. I think it's important to note that visibility can also shape perceptions. For instance, you see a police car, or different media coverage, body camera publicity, anti-drug campaigns, or publicized prosecutions. All of these things can play a part in a person's perceived certainty. Now, perceptual deterrence research also includes major methodological challenges, which leads us directly to the next two slides. Perceptual deterrence research. Perceptual deterrence research asks us a central question. do perceived sanctions actually reduce offending? This became one of the major empirical areas within deterrence theory. Researchers began surveying individuals about how likely they perceived punishment was, how severe they believed sanctions would be, and whether or not those perceptions predicted offending behavior. Overall, research generally finds some support for perceptual deterrence. Individuals who perceive higher certainty of punishment often report lower offending. However, the findings are not always consistent, and several important problems can emerge. First, perceptions are unstable. People constantly update their perceptions based on personal experience, peer experiences, media exposure, police encounters, and punishment avoidance. Second, offenders may systematically misperceive risk. Some offenders become overly optimistic and believe they're unlikely to get caught. Others may normalize punishment because offending is common within their peer networks. Third, perceptions themselves may be shaped by prior offending. This becomes a central causal order problem in deterrence research. Do perceptions reduce crime? Or do people who already offended simply develop lower perception of punishment risk? That question becomes one of the most important critiques in the entire deterrence literature. Now we move into experimental effects problem. So this is a critical methodological issue in deterrence research. This issue was heavily discussed by the work of Salzman, Pasternaster, and Waldo and Kriskos. The final issue in this section is endogeneity and causal order. This is perhaps one of the more sophisticated methodological critiques of deterrence theory. The core problem is, do sanctions deter crime, or do law-abiding individuals simply perceive punishment differently than offenders? And this matters because many deterrence studies rely on self-reported perceptions. Suppose researchers find that individuals who perceive high punishment certainty offend less. At first glance, this appears to support deterrence theory, but an alternative explanation still exists. Perhaps conforming individuals are simply more fearful, more trusting of authority, or more socially bonded, leading them both to perceive higher risks of punishment and to offend less. Meanwhile, experienced offenders may become cynical about enforcement and therefore perceive lower risks. If so, perceptions may partly reflect pre-existing differences rather than causal deterrent effects. This creates an endogeneity problem. The independent variable, perceived risk, may itself be shaped by offending behavior, personality, peer context, or prior experiences. And this is why deterrence research became increasingly methodologically sophisticated over time. Scholars started to use longitudinal designs, panel data, fixed effects models, and more advanced causal inference strategies. So to address these issues, Paternoster's critique of deterrence research strongly emphasizes these methodological challenges. Now, from a comprehensive exam perspective, this section would be extremely important. A weak answer would say that deterrence theory argues that punishment prevents crimes, but a stronger answer for a deterrence theory exam would be stating that modern deterrence research increasingly focuses on perceptual deterrence, but scholars have raised major concerns regarding causal order, punishment avoidance, experimental effects, and endogeneity. These critiques complicate claims that perceived sanctions directly cause reductions in offending, and this is more advanced criminological thinking. And with this, we can transition into rational choice theory, where the focus shifts from punishment systems broadly to situational decision-making and offender choices within specific criminal events. So this is an important transition because students often mistake or treat these theories as identical. And admittedly, they are closely related and they do share many common classical foundations, but it's not the same. Deterrence theory primarily focuses on punishment systems and legal sanctions. The central question in deterrence theory is, how does punishment discourage offending? Rational choice theory broadens the analysis. Instead of focusing only on punishment, rational choice theory examines how offenders make decisions within specific situations. The central question here becomes, why does crime deter in this specific context at this specific moment under these specific conditions? This is a major conceptual shift. Deterrence theory often operates at a broader, more system-level perspective. Rational choice theory becomes a much more situational and event-oriented. And this shift was strongly influenced by the work of Derek Cornish and Ronald Clark, particularly The Reasoning Criminal, published in 1986. Cornish and Clark argued that offenders are not necessarily perfectly rational, but they are purposeful actors making choices within constraints. And this wording matters. Modern rational choice theory does not require perfect rationality. Instead, it assumes limited rationality, situational adaptation, and bounded decision-making. This distinction is critical because one of the bigger criticisms of classic deterrence theory is that it assumes too much calculation and too much information. Cornish and Clark attempted to preserve the idea that offenders make decisions while acknowledging that those decisions may be imperfect, emotional, rushed, biased, or constrained by circumstance. So, rational choice theory becomes sometimes more psychologically realistic than early classical criminology. Another important difference here is that rational choice theory focuses heavily on criminal opportunity. This means the theory is less concerned with why someone becomes criminal in a broad developmental sense, but it's more concerned with why crime occurs at a particular place in time. For example, why does a burglary happen in one neighborhood rather than another? Why does a theft occur when guardianship is weak? Why does an offender choose one target over another? Why do some crimes cluster around certain routines or opportunities? These are situational questions. This situational focus eventually became highly influential for environmental criminology and situational crime prevention. Now, one important comprehensive exam point here would be that rational choice theory does not necessarily assume offenders are master planners, rather that offenders are viewed as decision makers operating under constraints. Rational choice theory argues that crime is purposive, goal-oriented, and situational. This doesn't mean that crime is always economically motivated. The reward that offenders seek may include things such as money, excitement, revenge, status, peer approval, emotional release, ideological goals, or some sort of symbolic meaning. The key point here is that offenders perceive some sort of benefit from the offending. At the same time, offenders also face potential costs, such as arrest, punishment, injury, retaliation, shame, social stigma, or failure. Crime occurs when the offender perceives the benefits as outweighing the risks and effort associated with the offense. Now, one of the most important contributions of rational choice theory is that it focuses on the immediate crime event. Traditional criminology theories often focus on long-term causes of criminality: childhood socialization, poverty, peer groups, family structure, or low self-control, perhaps strain or neighborhood disadvantage. Rational choice theory asks a very different question. Even if someone is motivated to offend, then why does the offense occur at this particular moment? This is where situational decision-making becomes important. For example, consider burglary. A burglar may evaluate whether anyone is in the home, visibility of the home from the street, potential alarm systems, the lighting, entry points, neighborhood surveillance, escape routes, and just the target attractiveness. These are all situational calculations. Similarly, a shoplifter may evaluate the employee's attention, camera placement, the store layout, crowd density, and concealment opportunities. Again, these are situational decisions. So rational choice theory therefore becomes highly useful for explaining crime patterns and opportunity structures. Now, another major contribution to rational choice theory is that it recognizes crime-specific decision-making. Crime involves different calculations. A person committing corporate fraud may engage in extensive planning and long-term cost-benefit analysis. A street robbery may involve much shorter decision windows. Drug offenses, cybercrime, vandalism, terrorism, and domestic violence may each involve different forms of rationality and different situational pressures. And this is why rational choice theory became increasingly nuanced compared to early classical criminology. Rather than assuming that all offenders think identically, rational choice theories acknowledge variability across different offense types and contexts. And I would say that this is one of the theory's greatest strengths. So for a comprehensive exam answer at UF, potentially, I believe that a strong answer would emphasize that rational choice theory is based around situations. It's offense-specific, opportunity-focused, and grounded in bounded decision-making rather than perfect rationality. Now, let's expand further on the crime-specific decision-making model here, because I think this is one of the more important refinements introduced by Cornish and Clark. So, classical deterrence theory often treats crime in relatively broad terms. Rational choice theory, however, argues that offenders make different decisions depending on the offense context. So this means that different crimes would involve different motivations, risks, rewards, constraints, and situational dynamics. So, example, compare corporate fraud, burglary, homicide, terrorism, and shoplifting. These offenses all are different and they involve fundamentally different decision structures. Corporate crime often involves delayed punishment, complex organizational environments, low visibility, and high financial rewards. Street robbery may involve immediate risk, short-term reward, and rapid situational decisions. Terrorism may involve more ideological goals where traditional punishment threats become less effective because offenders value symbolic or political outcomes over their own personal safety. And this is why rational choice theory becomes especially useful for explaining variation across different crime types. Another important idea here is that rationality itself may also vary across situations. An offender may behave rationally in one context and impulsively in another. For example, an individual may carefully plan out a burglary but commit an assault impulsively during a heated argument. This flexibility makes rational choice theory more adaptable than a simplistic versions of deterrence theory. Now, rational choice theorists have also developed the concept of crime scripts. Crime scripts develop the sequence of decisions and actions involved in committing offenses. Think of this as almost like a behavioral blueprint. For example, a burglary script might involve target selection, surveillance, entry method, theft, escape, disposal of stolen goods. Now, analyzing these different crime scripts allows researchers and policymakers to identify intervention points where crime can be disrupted. And this becomes especially important for situational crime prevention later on. Now, from a comp's perspective, I would say there's an important distinction that deterrence theory is primarily asking, how does punishment discourage offending? And rational choice theory is asking how offenders make decisions within criminal events. This distinction sounds simple, but conceptually it's very important. One of the biggest criticisms of classic criminology is that it assumes that offenders are fully rational. But in reality, human decision-making is imperfect. This leads us to bounded rationality. Bounded rationality refers to the idea that individuals make decisions under cognitive, emotional, informational, and situational constraints. In other words, people attempt to make rational decisions, but their rationality is limited. This is one of the most important refinements in modern rational choice theory. Offenders may lack complete information. They may make decisions under stress. They may act impulsively. They may misunderstand risks. They may focus heavily on immediate rewards while discounting future consequences. And they may rely on their emotions, habits, peer pressure, or cognitive shortcuts. This means that decision-making is imperfect rather than fully calculated. Cornish and Clark recognized this problem and argued that offenders engage in what Herbert Simon called satisficing rather than optimizing. Satisficing means that individuals often seek decisions that are good enough rather than perfectly optimal. This means that offenders rarely possess complete information about police activity, sentence structures, witness behavior, or future consequences. Instead, they try to make decisions using partial information and rough judgments. Now, bounded rationality also helps explain why deterrent effects are often inconsistent. If offenders misperceive risks, overestimate rewards, or heavily discount future punishment, then increasing legal penalties may have weaker effects than classical theory predicts. This becomes especially important when we consider impulsive offending. For example, things like bar fights, domestic violence, retaliatory violence, road rage, or intoxicated assaults. All of these occur under emotional arousal and limited deliberation. In these situations, rational calculation may be severely constrained. This doesn't necessarily mean that deterrence is irrelevant, however. Rather, it means that deterrence effects vary depending on the offender's cognitive and emotional state. And this is a very important nuance. A weak critique would say that people are irrational, so deterrence theory is wrong. But a stronger critique would say that decision-making is bounded and situational, which means that deterrence effects are conditional rather than universal. That is a much more sophisticated criminological reasoning. Now we move into another major refinement of rational choice theory, heuristics and cognitive biases. Research by Pogarski, Roach, and Pickett often examined how offenders rely on cognitive shortcuts when evaluating punishment risk in decision-making. Heuristics are mental shortcuts that people use to simplify decision-making. Rather than carefully calculating all possible outcomes, individuals often rely on simplified judgments. This is extremely common in everyday life, and it also applies to offending behavior. One example is the availability heuristic. People estimate risk based on how easily examples come to mind. For example, if someone recently heard about several burglaries that went unsolved, they may underestimate their punishment risk. Conversely, if media coverage heavily publicizes arrests, individuals may overestimate certainty. Another example is optimism bias. Many offenders believe that they're smarter than the police, that they're less likely to get caught, or that they can successfully avoid punishment. This optimism bias can significantly weaken deterrence. Present orientation is another important bias. Individuals can often focus heavily on immediate rewards while discounting long-term consequences. This is particularly important for impulsive offending and adolescent offending. The immediate reward of offending may feel psychologically stronger than distant punishment threats. Now, these insights are important because they move rational choice theory away from simplistic economic models. Human decision-making is shaped by things like emotion, memory, perception, biases, social influence, and cognitive limitations. And this makes modern rational choice theory much more psychologically realistic. But at the same time, these findings also complicate deterrence theory. If offenders systematically misjudge risk, then simply increasing the punishment severity may not substantially alter their behaviors. Again, certainty and visibility become critically important because they shape offender perceptions more directly. Now, moving into emotional deterrence, one of the major recent developments in deterrence research is emotional deterrence. So, traditional deterrence theory focuses heavily on formal punishment, such as things like arrests, imprisonment, fines, legal sanctions, but modern scholars increasingly recognize that social and emotional costs may also deter offending. Research by Pickett, Roach, and Pogarski emphasize that emotions such as shame, guilt, and embarrassment, and fear can influence offending decisions. Now, this is extremely important because it broadens deterrence beyond formal legal punishment. For many individuals, individuals, social consequences may matter more than formal sanctions. For example, disappointing family members, losing social status, damaging their relationships, embarrassment, or threats to their identity. All of these may strongly discourage offending, and this is especially relevant for offenses where social reputation matters heavily. For example, corporate professionals may fear reputational damage as much as imprisonment. Students may fear embarrassment or family disappointment. Police officers may fear career consequences and public scrutiny. Now, emotional deterrence also overlaps with procedural justice and legitimacy research. People may comply with the law not simply because they fear punishment, but because they value social approval, moral identity, and legitimacy. This complicates purely instrumental deterrence models. Again, this does not invalidate deterrence theory as a whole, though. Rather, it's more expanding our understanding of how deterrence may operate psychologically. So, to expand on this further, punishment is not just limited to legal sanctions. Crime can produce shame, guilt, embarrassment, family disappointment, social stigma, identity threats, and reputational harm. Now, these social and emotional costs can become powerful deterrents on their own. For example, Allen, Murphy, and Bates studied compliance among young drivers and found that shame-related emotions influenced compliance. Now, this matters because it suggests that deterrence is not purely legal or economic. Deterrence may also operate socially and emotionally. This insight helps us to bridge deterrence theory with other criminological perspectives. For example, social control theory emphasizes attachments and social bonds. Labeling theory emphasizes stigma and identity. Procedural justice emphasizes legitimacy, and social learning theory emphasizes pure reactions. Emotional deterrence partially overlaps with all of these perspectives, and this is one reason modern criminology increasingly integrates theories rather than treating them as completely isolated. Now we arrive at one of the most important policy applications of rational choice theory, that being situational crime prevention. Situational crime prevention focuses on reducing criminal opportunities rather than changing offender motivation. And this is a very important distinction. Traditional criminological theories often ask, how can we change offenders? But situational crime prevention asks, how do we change the environments so that crime becomes more difficult and less attractive? This logic comes directly from rational choice theory. If offenders evaluate effort, risk, reward, and opportunity, then crime can be reduced by altering those situational factors. Situational crime prevention strategies generally aim to increase effort, increase risk, reduce rewards, reduce provocations, or remove excuses. Now, examples of this can include things like CCTV cameras, improved lighting, target hardening, access control, anti-theft devices, surveillance systems, neighborhood guardianship, and environmental design. For example, better lighting may increase perceived visibility and therefore increased perceived risk. Steering wheel locks increase the effort. Security cameras increase the perceived certainty of detection. Locked access points reduce opportunity. Now, you can notice something important here, that many of these situational prevention strategies don't rely on harsher punishments. Instead, they rely on manipulating the opportunity structures and perceived risks. And this is one reason that rational choice theory became highly influential in modern policing and environmental criminology. Now, critics would sometimes argue that situational prevention merely displaces crime rather than preventing it. For example, offenders may simply move to a different location or choose softer targets. However, research often finds that displacement is incomplete and that situational interventions can meaningfully reduce offending overall. Now, for a comprehensive exam, I think this would be an important synthesis point, is that deterrence theory focuses heavily on punishment systems, while rational choice theory broadens the analysis toward situational opportunities and offender decision-making. Situational crime prevention operationalizes rational choice assumptions into concrete prevention strategies by manipulating effort, risk, and reward structures. And that sets us up perfectly for the next section, where we begin examining modern policy applications, empirical evidence, imprisonment effects, and broader strengths and weaknesses of deterrence and rational choice theory. Now, let's move into one of the more important applied areas of deterrence theory, that being policing. Modern policing strategies frequently rely on deterrence assumptions, even when departments do not explicitly describe them in theoretical terms. The central deterrence assumption in policing is that visible enforcement increases the perceived certainty of punishment. If offenders believe that police presence is high, then offending should become riskier and therefore less attractive. This logic underlies many contemporary policing strategies. For example, hotspot policing, focused deterrence, directed patrols, stop and frisk practices, gang suppression initiatives, and DUI checkpoints. All of these rely at least partially on deterrence principles. So take hotspot policing as an example. example. Research consistently shows that crime tends to cluster geographically in relatively small areas. Police departments often respond by concentrating patrols and enforcement in those locations. The deterrence logic is straightforward. Increased police visibility increases perceived certainty of apprehension. Offenders may then avoid offending in those areas because they perceive elevated risk. Similarly, focused deterrence strategies, sometimes called pulling levers policing, attempt to communicate highly specific deterrence messages to chronic offenders or gang members. The strategy is often, if the violence continues, enforcement pressure will only increase rapidly and collectively. So these approaches rely heavily on certainty in communication. But notice something important here is that the emphasis is not often on the extreme punishment severity, rather the focus is on predictability, visibility, communication, and certainty. Again, this reflects Beccaria's original insight that certainty matters more than severity. Now, this also connects closely to body-worn camera research and procedural justice. For example, body-worn cameras may increase perceived accountability and visibility. In theory, this could increase deterrence by increasing perceived certainty that misconduct will be detected and documented. But deterrence effects may depend heavily on perception. If officers believe misconduct will actually be reviewed and sanctioned, deterrence may increase. If they believe accountability systems are weak or inconsistent, deterrence effects may diminish. And this is another example of why perceptual deterrence matters so much. Now, there are important critiques here as well. Aggressive deterrence-based policing strategies may generate distrust, legitimacy concerns, racial disparities, over-policing, and strained community relations. This becomes especially important when certainty is increased unevenly across neighborhoods or populations. So deterrence-based policing may reduce some forms of crime while simultaneously generating legitimacy and inequality concerns, and this is exactly the kind of nuanced discussion expected in a comprehensive answer. So now let's shift into corporate crime. Corporate crime presents an especially interesting challenge for deterrence theory because corporate offenders often differ substantially from street offenders. In many cases, corporate offenders may actually fit deterrence assumptions better than impulsive offenders do. Why is this? Well, this is because corporate offenses often involve things like planning, delayed gratification, organizational decision-making, financial incentives, and strategic calculations. For example, executives committing a fraud may evaluate regulatory oversight, the likelihood of detection, the financial gain, organizational pressures, and reputational risks. This appears highly compatible with rational choice and deterrence models. However, corporate crime also creates important complications. One major issue is low certainty of punishment. Corporate crime is often difficult to detect and prosecute. Complex organizational structures may diffuse responsibility, making accountability difficult. Additionally, punishments for white-collar offenses are often inconsistent or perceived as less severe than punishments for street crime. Now, this creates a potential deterrence problem. If executives believe that detection is unlikely, that prosecution is rare, that the penalties are manageable, or corporations can absorb fines, then deterrent effects would weaken substantially. Simpson and Coper's work on corporate crime emphasizes these challenges and explores how organizational dynamics shape deterrent processes. Now, another important point is that corporate crime often involves organizational cultures and peer dynamics. So this means that deterrence alone may not fully explain offending. Social learning processes, organizational norms, and incentive structures may reinforce misconduct even when legal sanctions do exist. For example, if employees are rewarded heavily for financial performance while rule violations are ignored, organizational reinforcement may overpower deterrent pressures. This is an excellent example of theory integration. A sophisticated criminological answer does not assume one theory explains everything. Instead, strong answers recognize that deterrence, rational choice, organizational learning, and structural incentives may all interact. So now let's discuss one of the more controversial applications of deterrence theory, that being terrorism. Terrorism presents major challenges for traditional deterrence assumptions. Classical deterrence theory assumes that offenders value self-preservation and wish to avoid punishment. But what happens when offenders embrace martyrdom, they value ideological goals over their own survival, or if they view punishment as a meaningful sacrifice? In these cases, traditional punishment threats might lose their effectiveness. This is one of the reasons why terrorism is often viewed as a difficult case for deterrence theory. For example, suicide terrorism appears fundamentally incompatible with simple deterrence assumptions because the offender does not expect to survive the offense. However, we should be careful not to oversimplify this issue. A sophisticated analysis recognizes that rationality depends on goals. Terrorists may still behave rationally in the sense that they pursue goals strategically. The goals are simply different. Rather than maximizing personal safety, offenders may seek ideological influence, symbolic impact, political destabilization, religious meaning, or group status. And this is extremely important. A common mistake in assuming rationality always means self-preservation or financial gain. But rational choice theory only assumes purposive action toward the value goals. Now, deterrence may still operate in some forms of terrorism, for example, organizational leaders, financial supporters, logistical coordinators, or politically motivated groups may respond to certainty and risk calculations, even if an individual operative does not. Additionally, deterrence may influence target selection rather than eliminating offending entirely. For example, hardened security may redirect attacks toward less protected locations. This connects terrorism research closely to situational crime prevention or opportunity structures. Again, this demonstrates why rational choice theory became influential beyond traditional street crime. The theory can adapt to different offense contexts as long as analysts carefully define the goals, risks, constraints, and opportunities. Now, for a comprehensive exam, terrorism is an excellent example of scope conditions. Deterrence theory may struggle to explain ideologically motivated offending, where punishment threats are discounted or embraced, although rational choice principles might still apply if offenders pursue strategic goals under constraints. Now we reach the empirical status of deterrence. What does the empirical evidence really show us? Well, this is where many of the students will become too simplistic. A weak answer would say that deterrence works or that deterrence does not work, but the empirical reality is much more nuanced than this. Overall, deterrence research generally finds modest support for deterrence effects, particularly regarding the certainty of punishment. But the evidence varies substantially depending on the offense type, offender characteristics, measurement strategy, and the type of deterrence being studied. One of the strongest conclusions in modern deterrence research is that certainty consistently performs better empirically than severity. Nagin's review of deterrence research strongly emphasizes this point. Chalfin and McCary conclude that policing and apprehension certainty tend to produce more consistent deterrent effects than harsher sentencing alone. Severity effects, by contrast, are often inconsistent or weak. Increasing sentence length frequently produces diminishing returns, and this is especially important because many criminal justice systems focus heavily on punitive severity. Now, another important finding is that deterrence effects vary by offense type. Deterrence tends to perform better for planned offenses, economic crimes, regulatory offenses, and crimes involving some level of calculation. Deterrence tends to perform worse for those crimes that are impulsive, emotionally driven, intoxication-related crimes, and crimes involving severe cognitive impairment. Again, this highlights the scope conditions. Another important issue involves offender heterogeneity. Not all offenders perceive risk the same way. Some individuals heavily discount punishment. Others become desensitized through repeated offending. Others may possess low self-control or strong peer reinforcement that weakens deterrence. This is why modern deterrence theory increasingly incorporates perception, cognition, emotion, and social context. Now, an extremely important comprehensive exam point would be that deterrence research became increasingly sophisticated because scholars recognized major methodological challenges. So some of these challenges include things like endogeneity, punishment avoidance, perceptual instability, and causal order problems. A sophisticated comprehensive answer should explicitly acknowledge all of these constraints rather than presenting deterrence findings uncritically. Now let's move into one of the more important debates in deterrence research. Does imprisonment reduce future offending? Classical deterrence theory predicts that punishment should discourage future crime. However, modern research on imprisonment and recidivism complicates this assumption substantially. Research by Nagin, Cullen, and Johnson reviews evidence suggesting imprisonment may sometimes increase future offending rather than reducing it. And this is a major challenge for simplistic deterrence assumptions. Why might imprisonment increase crime? Several mechanisms are commonly discussed. First, prison may expose offenders to criminal peers. This is sometimes referred to as the school of crime hypothesis. Offenders may develop criminal networks, learn techniques, or reinforce deviant identities while incarcerated. Second, imprisonment may weaken conventional social bonds. Individuals might lose employment, family relationships, educational opportunities, and community ties. Control theorists would argue that these weakened bonds increase offending risk. Third, imprisonment creates stigma. Formerly incarcerated individuals often face things like employment barriers, housing discrimination, social exclusion, and the labeling effects. These factors may increase criminal involvement after release. Fourth, incarceration may strengthen criminal identity. Rather than deterring crime, punishment may reinforce alienation and deviance. Now, this doesn't mean that punishment never deters, but it does mean that punishment can generate competing effects. So punishment might deter some offenders, incapacitate others, and criminogenically influence others. And this is why criminologists increasingly have to distinguish between deterrence, incapacitation, rehabilitation, and criminology criminogenic punishment effects. These are direct mechanisms. For comprehensive exams, this is extremely important. A sophisticated comprehensive answer should recognize that imprisonment might reduce crime in the short term through incapacitation, while simultaneously increasing future offending through criminogenic effects, and this distinction demonstrates conceptual clarity. Now let's summarize some of the major critiques of deterrence theory. The first critique is excessive rationality assumptions. Critics argue that deterrence theory assumes offenders think too carefully and systematically before offending. Many crimes occur under emotion, intoxication, anger, stress, or impulsivity. This weakens rational calculation. The second critique involves inequality in structural context. Deterrence theory often focuses heavily on individual choice while paying less attention to poverty, blocked opportunities, neighborhood disadvantage, discrimination, and structural inequality. Strain theorists especially criticize deterrence for underestimating social pressure. Third, strain theorists especially criticize deterrence for underestimating social pressures. Deterrence research faces serious measurement problems. Researchers struggle to measure perceptions accurately, causal distinction, causal direction, punishment certainty, and subjective risk assessment. Fourth, deterrence may justify punitive excesses. So policies that emphasize harsh punishment can contribute to mass incarceration, sentencing disparities, aggressive policing, and legitimacy concerns. This is especially important in the United States, where deterrence rhetoric has historically supported high punitive criminal justice policies. Fifth, deterrent effects may vary substantially across offenders and offenses. This means that the theory may lack universal explanatory power. Again, this returns us back to the scope conditions. Strong theories explain when and where they apply, and not simply whether they apply universally. Now let's examine how other criminological theories critique deterrence theory, beginning with strain theory. So strain theorists argue that crime often emerges from pressure, frustration, blocked opportunities, and negative emotions rather than rational calculation alone. Merton's strain theory emphasized blocked access to legitimate success. Agnew's general strain theory later expanded strain theory substantially by emphasizing negative emotions, anger, stress, victimization, and adverse experiences. And this creates a major contrast with deterrence theory. Deterrence theory assumes that offenders evaluate the costs and benefits, but strain theory argues that emotional pressure may overwhelm rational calculation. For example, things like anger, humiliation, chronic stress, and frustration. All of these may produce impulsive or emotional reactive offending. This is especially important for victims of violent crime. An individual acting in a rage during a domestic dispute might not carefully calculate punishment risks beforehand. Similarly, chronic strain may create desperation that weakens deterrence effects. This critique does not necessarily eliminate deterrence theory. Rather, it suggests that deterrence effects may weaken under high emotional strain. This is another excellent example of conditional explanation rather than total rejection. A strong comprehensive answer would directly contrast the assumptions. While deterrence theory assumes that offending reflects rational cost-benefit calculation, strain theory emphasizes emotional pressure and blocked opportunities as drivers of crime. Now, let's examine the social learning critique. Social learning theorists argue that crime is learned through interaction with others. Akers expanded Sutherland's differential association theory by emphasizing definitions favorable to crime, reinforcement, imitation, and peer influence. This creates another major challenge for deterrence theory. Deterrence theory focuses heavily on punishment. Social learning theory argues that peer rewards and social enforcement may overpower punishment threats. For example, offending may produce peer approval, group status, excitement, financial rewards, or identity reinforcement. If these rewards are immediate and socially meaningful, they may outweigh distant punishment risks. Additionally, offenders embedded in criminal peer networks may normalize offending and minimize punishment concerns. This can significantly weaken deterrence effects. Social learning theorists therefore argue that punishment alone cannot fully explain offending behavior. Instead, offending must be understood within broader social environments and reinforced systems. Again, notice how these theories are beginning to interact. Modern criminology increasingly recognizes that punishment, peers, emotion, opportunity, structure, and self-control all influence crime simultaneously. And that's one reason that theoretical integration became increasingly important in criminology. And in the next section, we'll conclude by discussing self-control techniques, theory integration, final exam takeaways, and the broader legacy of deterrence and rational choice theory in modern criminology. Now, self-control theory, developed by Gottfredson and Hershey, a general theory of crime published in 1990, argues that crime is primarily driven by low self-control rather than rational calculation. According to self-control theory, individuals individuals with low self-control tend to be impulsive, risk-seeking, short-sighted, self-centered, and insensitive to long-term consequences. Now, this creates a major challenge for deterrence assumptions. If offenders are highly impulsive and focused on immediate gratification, then future punishment threats may have relatively little influence on their behavior. In other words, individuals with low self-control may heavily discount future consequences, and this becomes especially important for crimes involving intoxication, emotional reactions, or immediate rewards. For example, someone acting impulsively during a bar fight might not stop to evaluate the arrest probability, sentence length, or the long-term legal consequences. Instead, immediate emotion and impulse dominate the decision-making here. This critique overlaps somewhat with bounded rationality, but it goes further. Bounded rationality still assumes offenders attempt some level of decision-making under constraints. Self-control theory argues many offenders may not meaningfully deliberate at all before offending. Now, an important nuance here is that self-control theory does not completely eliminate deterrent effects. Even highly impulsive individuals may still respond somewhat to certainty and situational constraints. For example, visible guardianship, immediate supervision, or rapid sanctioning. All of these may still shape behaviors, but self-control theorists would generally predict weaker deterrent effects among impulsive offenders compared to highly calculating offenders. This again reinforces one of the biggest themes of this lecture, that deterrence effects are conditional rather than universal. Now, for a comprehensive exam, this comparison is extremely important. A strong answer might say, deterrence theory assumes that offenders evaluate punishment risks before offending, whereas self-control theory argues that many offenders are impulsive, present-oriented, and relatively insensitive to future consequences. Thus, self-control theory challenges the rationality assumptions underlying the classical deterrence models. So modern criminology increasingly recognizes that no single theory fully explains crime. Each theory captures part of the bigger picture. Deterrence theory contributes important insights about punishment, incentives, risk perception, and decision-making. Rational choice theory contributes insights about situational opportunities, crime events, emotional structure, and bounded decision-making. But other theories contribute equally important dimensions. Strain theory emphasizes blocked opportunities, stress, negative emotions, and frustration. Social learning theory emphasizes peers, reinforcement, imitation, and definitions favorable to crime. Control theories emphasize social bonds, attachment, commitment, and self-control. Social disorganization theory emphasizes neighborhood structure, collective efficacy, social cohesion, and informal control. Life course theories emphasize things like development, turning points, persistence, and desistance. The key insight here is that these theories are not always mutually exclusive. In many cases, they explain different levels or dimensions of crime. For example, consider a hypothetical offender. Strain theory may explain why the individual experiences frustration or pressure. Social learning theory may explain how criminal definitions and techniques were learned. Self-control theory may explain impulsivity. Rational choice theory may explain target selection and situational decision-making. Deterrence theory might explain whether punishment risk influences offending decisions. All of these processes may operate simultaneously, and this is one reason why modern criminology increasingly favors theoretical integration rather than rigid theoretical camps. Now, this doesn't mean that all of these theories are fully compatible. Some theories contain conflicting assumptions. For example, classical theories emphasize rational choice and free will, while positive theories often emphasize structural or developmental constraints. But even conflicting theories might explain different parts of criminal behavior, and this is extremely important for comprehensive exams. Examiners generally don't want simplistic, one theory explains everything answers. Crime is multifaceted, and that different theories can explain different dimensions of offending. Now let's summarize the major takeaways from deterrence theory and rational choice theory. The first and most important takeaway is this: certainty consistently receives stronger empirical support than severity. This is one of the most robust findings in deterrence research. Increasing the perceived likelihood of punishment generally matters more than dramatically increasing sentence harshness. Second, perceptions matter more than objective punishment levels. Individuals respond primarily to perceived risk rather than formal legal statistics. This is why perceptual deterrence research became so important. Third, rationality is bounded. Modern rational choice theory does not assume perfect calculation. Decision-making is shaped by emotion, cognitive limitations, stress, peer influence, and situational constraints. Fourth, deterrence effects vary across offenses and offenders. Deterrence tends to work better for planned, calculated, and opportunity-based offenses, rather than impulsive, emotional, or intoxicated-driven crimes. Fifth, punishment may produce different criminogenic effects. Imprisonment can weaken social bonds, increase stigma, and expose offenders to criminal peers. years and increase recidivism. This means that punishment does not automatically reduce crime. Sixth, modern deterrence research faces important methodological challenges. These include endogeneity, punishment avoidance, perceptual instability, and causal order problems. This is extremely important for advanced theory discussions. It's important to acknowledge these limitations. Seventh, rational choice theory significantly expanded classical criminology by focusing on situational decision-making, opportunity structures, crime-specific calculations, and situational crime prevention. And finally, one of the biggest broader lessons is that deterrence and rational choice theories remain highly influential because they're deeply connected to criminal justice policy. Even today, many criminal justice institutions operate on deterrence assumptions, whether explicitly or implicitly. That enduring influence is one reason that these theories remain central to criminology theory in comprehensive exams. So how should we ultimately evaluate deterrence theory and rational choice theory? I think the answer is that both theories remain enormously influential, but both are incomplete. Deterrence theory provides one of the clearest frameworks for understanding how punishment might shape behavior. It explains why visible enforcement matters, why certainty often outperforms severity, and why legal systems attempt to structure incentives. Rational choice theory extends this framework by focusing on situational opportunities, bounded rationality, and offender decision-making within crime events. Together, these theories shifted criminology toward a more decision-oriented understanding of offending. But modern criminology also demonstrates the limits of purely rational models. People are influenced by emotions, peer groups, social structure, neighborhood conditions, developmental processes, inequality, and cognitive limitations. This means crime cannot be reduced entirely to simple cost-benefit calculations. At the same time, however, it would also be incorrect to dismiss rationality entirely. Many offenders clearly do respond to incentives, opportunities, and perceived risks. And this is why deterrence and rational choice theory continue to matter. The best modern interpretation is probably not people are perfectly rational, nor is it that people are completely irrational. Rather, modern criminology increasingly recognizes that human behavior evolves, bounded rationality operating within social and structural contexts. And this is the broader synthesis, and that synthesis is exactly the type of thinking that hopefully comprehensive exams are designed to evaluate. Now I have several different broader discussion questions that would help to tie these theories together. And of course, my references for the lecture that are coming just directly from core readings associated with deterrence theory and rational choice theory from criminology reading lists. And with this said, I conclude my lecture on deterrence and rational choice theory, and I thank you for your time if you stuck around this long.